Welcome to another edition of Critical Thinking Live, where we bring you leaders, decision makers, influencers, thinkers, commentators from all over the world and in Europe to discuss what matters to Europe. On this occasion, it's one of my annual gigs that I have a chat with the top man at the McKinsey Global Institute, the chair, and we've been doing this for about 2 or 3 years to think about where we find ourselves in terms of the economic forecast for Europe. Today is no surprise. We have Sven Smit. Again, I'm very grateful that you've made the time to chat with us and share some of your thinking. We talk about this session, this Critical Thinking Live, being around achieving an intelligent Europe, bridging gaps with investments, etc. Achieving an intelligent Europe. Say a little bit about what you're understanding currently from the geopolitical, trade, economic turmoil that the world's facing now, but into the rest of the year ahead. So what's your take on where we find ourselves, and what's the data telling you about how we should respond?
Very good to be with you again. This has indeed been an annual event that I look forward to, and I hope our listeners are looking forward to as well. We've been debating over these talks that and in positioning and thinking about it in this way, that we are heading into a new era. That's sort of the world that we lived in over the last 35 years that we have been gotten comfortable with is not the world we will live in the next 20 years for many reasons. The geopolitics are different, the multipolarity, if you want to call it that way. The technology is going to be on automation. The demographics are peaking. We need way more energy and different energy. That's also a big transition. And the financial system is very different now. Higher interest rates, inflation, we're gyrating this week, exchange rates and all that kind of stuff. And I would say all the signs of what we're going through right now, whether it's rotations in the political system, rotations in the economic system, are all part of us getting into this new era. And as you do a progression from a model that worked for the last 35 years to a progression that is the model that we hope to be good for us in the next 35 years, reality is much wilder than if you're settled in. We're not settled in, and that's why we're trying to find new ways. And in different administrations, this happens with different levels of boldness, wildness, or whatever you want to call it. I do think that I'm as I said last time also, I'm long-term optimistic because the technology potential is there to have good and abundant energy. The technology potential is there to have good stuff for everyone. The good technology potential is there for us to be productive intelligently. The potential is there for humanity to thrive. So there's just the question is, are we going to get there? And if you think about it economically from call it a midterm goal, for example, the turmoil that we're in right now with tariffs is about trade and many other things that are related to it. But in the world, somewhere the US has to rebalance a little bit to produce more of what it does itself and be less consumerist. China will have to become an even stronger domestic consumer and maybe not only the only world's exporter. Europe needs to be competitive, which we all want, because otherwise it doesn't play the right role in trade. And the global south, if you want to call it that way, or the rest of the world needs to connect properly to also have access to prosperity on that. I think that's called a vision or a goal that most people would subscribe to. Within that, we want equality and many other things, and we want it to be in a trusted environment, and it should feel good to all of us and go in the right way and not have the externalities that we have. The question is, how do you get from A to B? So I think if you then, since we're here with Friends of Europe, maybe focus a little bit on Europe first, and then we can bring the rest in. I'm, in the spirit of being the optimist that I always told you to be, relative to where we were, let's say 5 years ago. I think 5 years ago, the diagnostic was articulated in places, but was not agreed publicly.
Yeah.
I don't think many people didn't understand that there was a problem, but a public acknowledgement in what landed in the Draghi report and the Letta report, so on, I think is what many people were saying from many places. And we are having a shared diagnostic. And that is actually very useful. Because I don't think anyone is debating the diagnostic anymore. There's little corners. Should we have more deregulation? Should we have more this or that? But nobody's debating the diagnostic. that does provide a platform from which you can then say, are the actions we're taking sufficient to overcome the diagnostic? If Draghi says the electricity price needs to sort of go down by factor 2 or 3 for us to have a competitive energy system, okay, now we can hold every action to whether that's actually happening.
Mm.
Same thing is we need to have some form of sovereign technology, at least, in some places have our own alternatives and so on. So, are we actually building the semiconductor stuff? Are we actually finding ourselves back in a good place with AI, with all the good talent that we have? So the beauty of the diagnostic is also that we have a yardstick of where to take it. Now, I think where we struggle is, and that's the discussion now on Europe, is will 27 country governance solve it? Or do we need the 28 regime that we talked about in the report to maybe do it there around coalitions of the willing? Even if the 27 would agree, does the bureaucracy still grind it to a halt? And the bureaucracy could be in Brussels, but the bureaucracy could also be at the single country level. And so you might have speed in Europe, and then you don't get the speed in the implementation. And so I believe we've moved from a diagnostic that sets a bar of change with some nuances to a place where people say, okay, are we executing? And I would say, the discussion in Davos, for example, this year was not at all about the diagnostic. It was all about, are we executing? And there was, skepsis and all kind of stuff also. But it is about, are we executing? And then there was the question of what the Americans are doing. Is that another step in the execution? So did the gap get bigger? Davos was on that pre-tariff, of course. But, I think that's I think the healthy part of Europe is we're moving forward.
Indeed, but Sven, okay, as you said quite rightly, we're in a position where we've gone post-diagnosis to understanding, and I liked it was quite interesting when you're saying, okay, there's a thing, we need to make sure electrification happens. We need to make sure that we've got, green tech or tech happening in a different way. So you almost create a set of, let's say, targets or areas and thematics that the whole commission should be focused on in getting towards and achieving. What's your advice to them? I know that it's not you're not political beasts, but in terms of the art of the possible and making something happen, we know this beast is administratively large, full of inertia, and only acts at times of adversity. So there is an adversity right now in this world, and it's almost like they need to treat it like a crisis and use a kind of what I would call a war room mentality to change. What's your perspective about the how, the actual how? Because it's great to say we've moved, we've gone beyond a shared diagnostic, but we've been here before to a certain extent over the past couple of decades, right? But we're now in a different kind of sense of reality, but mold breaking moment. So what's your advice to them who are listening at the commission about how they should do the business differently?
So I think the how is, in a way, the most important question now, since it's about execution. And then we can have the following discussion, which is the how it needs the same system, or does it need to have a breakthrough system? So we had this maybe a bit of a wild proposal in one of our reports that you were at the dinner when we launched it, to talk about a 28 region where basically coalition of the willing could actually put some stuff together that would be sort of a deal that makes some movement forward, whether that's on banking and fintech or whatever. So that 28 region example was, if everybody now has to write 160 APIs for every single bank, could you have a single API in the 28th country? And then, basically that accelerates it. So that's the leverage of the 28th country. I also believe that the world, conditioned, I think, also by what's happening in the US, is moving more, but even what the geopolitical moment almost dictates, is going to go more into a bilateral world. And not a full rules-based, I'm not saying the rules are going to be out of the water, but, a lot of the movement will be about a singular deal of a singular company or an industry with a legislative block where they collectively say, if you do this, we will do this. And then there's a marriage of sorts that then progresses a topic. And I think this is actually happening because let me give you an example. If we have to wait until we change all the labor regulation in Europe to the Draghi report levels, if we had to wait until the banking union is settled, if we had to wait, we know those things will have glacial speed, even if they go at high speed for Europe. But if we were to say in automotive, if combined with the defense spending, this is the way we would transition. This is the way that would be a path to profitability for the automotive industry plus the defense industry and so on. But for that, you need to create these conditions. And, you kind of ring fence it. China used to have the Shenzhen free zone. Could we have free zones, expanding the 28 region concept of particular deals that we make that make sense for the industry and make sense for Europe and make sense for the constituents countries that pitch in. I think if we would do 20 of these larger scale deals where maybe, we also differ from the standard regulation because we just make a fence that is a bit different, that will maybe unlock the experiment better. But I'm not saying that that's the only experiment, the 28 countries experiment, but we need to find just different execution vehicles. Whether that needs to be done for the first or the second or the third, I don't know. But if you're going to do 20, you can't have it at random. And as the commission is set up with lots of different angles and players in the chart, if you call it the big circle, you will need different players from all these corners and all the branches of Europe, but even the countries, to get it right. I do think it would be possible to say, let's do the first 3 projects, important projects on, automotive, for example, or whatever, and, get the people in the room, get close to a possible deal and so on. I'm actually not so worried that if we had the people in the room from the multiple sides, including the countries and the players, that you could come to a deal. I'm a little bit worried that the filters by which these deals will judge are still a little bit off versus diagnostic. So let me give you an example.
Please.
We wrote in the report that one of the impediments to European competitors is that the average profitability of the European companies is lower. What we cannot do is that in these projects, the expectations of profitability are not sufficient for the investment to be made. Yeah, we can't, because if you basically say, I can make this much money in the US and I can make this much money in Europe, and the net just doesn't, it doesn't work, it will never work. So I'm more worried, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe the execution is actually the bigger bottleneck. I'm slightly worried that lots of filters that are in all these regulations will still land in the project, while the intent of the project was to create a environment that is to extent a little freer, in which we can get the stuff done that needs to get done. And that somehow everybody coming in is still trying to say, but wait a minute, I'm actually responsible for this regulation, so it has to land into this. No, they have to be a little bit more free zones, including profitability differences, but also outcome differences, speed differences, permit differences. Yeah. So I actually think you could put 20 people in the room that actually could have the power, maybe even, or to do the permitting. And then they say, but wait a minute, that's not how we do things here.
But that's what I mean. You need a linchpin with authority and delegated responsibility, if you like. Someone, from the commission and the council say, we are in a kind of a war mentality. We need to do something urgently with pace. And here we've got, it could be 1 or 3 or whatever, but say you have the responsibility and the right to actually knock heads together and get things moving.
We have done it before. No,
okay.
I'm not going to have a vaccine discussion, but, it was America first, Europe second, if you want to call it that way.
Yeah.
And the second was pretty good in terms of getting the stuff to us. Had every country done that alone, it would have never worked. Okay. I think on energy, we need something like that. We are one of the largest buyers in the world. Can we not create leverage out of that? So then we take the scale, but we also then have to have execution that leverages that scale back into Europe. But I do think this is the one. Let me give you another some of these filters. If you look at the numbers that we did, the issue is not money. So I'm a little not saddened, but the focus of post Draghi was 800 billion needs to move.
Yeah,
that is only one element of the whole list of very good recommendations and all that kind of stuff.
Good.
But the focus gets there, and we know what that's contentious. The reality is, if you want to build, let's say, a large semiconductor facility in Europe, the permitting, the labor laws related to 24/7, and many, many other things are actually more breaking. And by the way, the total demand structure and the supply structure is not there. And so it's physical reality that's in the way, not money. Physical and regulatory reality that's in the way. And I've talked to many, many business people in Europe. They say, I'm happy to do projects in Europe. It's a great market. It's a big market. they like Europe, but if they can't get the business case to work, and I really hope, and one of the things that we're trying to do also in the coming year in our research is say, can we paint the picture of 10 or 15 of these business cases and show everybody where they break down to then make it very specific. Take this out, take that out, take that out, then this business case will work and life will continue.
Can you build on that? Because you've talked about your 18, I think, areas of competitiveness. If I've got the number right, I may have it wrong, but you've kind of mapped out in some of your reports that, these are, potential growth trajectories for Europe if you pick the right ones. Okay. I want you to, if you imagine this is my interpretation, and please come back at me on that potentially we're looking at a more interventionist approach by government. You might cast it differently. But from my perspective, an interventionist approach, can you think of an example that you could point to and say, that's the behaviors, that's the kind of different filters we need to have in place and the approach that needs to take place as a result?
So if you take the defense industry as an example, we are knowing, and it's in the plans and so on, to spend more. Yeah. We also know that if we don't find the proper way to create scale, we will be unbelievably inefficient. And for the money, we don't get the level of defense that we need. We will need to find a way on the back of Draghi, who said the M&A rules should change, the structuring rules should change, the way we test it and so on should change. And so to some degree, whether it's interventionist or not, you could say the Airbus event was at some point an intervention that created a company that is actually quite strong. I'm not going to go back to the business case, but that was that form of intervention. But to me, it's much more the people in the room setting up the discussion, the conditions, and then let them free inside those conditions. And so I think the intervention might have to be on the conditions, but it doesn't mean that, government in larger sense needs to go execute.
Okay.
I think it's more like, can we go, instead of, broad-based, rules-based, there a lot of stuff needs to happen on that too. Draghi has said it by sector in total, you be careful that you don't over-regulate, and then nobody wants to be there. But for these specific business cases, it means take these 5 impediments away, and then within those conditions, set people free. Yeah, so make sure the permit comes fast, and then after the permit, let them do what they need to do. And so I'm just the word intervention as a good thing in me, which is the intervention that sets up a zone that gives people the freedom. The word intervention that says, okay, but let's then go start controlling it at a very different level.
Sure, I get that.
So it's that balancing act on the intervention, I think.
You spoke, and when we've spoken before, most recently, about the ASML example. Can you talk about that in terms of what does this point to a new way of working potentially in terms of the relationship with what happened in?
What they wanted to get done was, get the infrastructure around that company right and the housing right so that they could scale. And there's something that's called Project Beethoven that was executed between a whole set of businesses, not just ASML, that are operating in that ecosystem to say what are the needs to get from A to B, and government went into a tent with that group of people, and they came up with a very significant, let's call it deal or approach or set of conditions to add electricity to the grid, to open up housing, build construction sites and so on, with the intent to create not a free zone, but an acceleration in that thing. That's still, it's the first time it happened in this scale. And I think that in that sense, it's an example. This one could be dealt with by a single country. I think if you take some industries, we talk defense, automotive, I don't think a single country can handle it. And by the way, some bigger European regulations will have to change. So that's another reason why a single country can't handle it. But it's in that sense a smaller example. But I think the many, many deals that are being made in the US are of the same nature. Where people say, if you do this, we'll do these investments, and they're sometimes discussed at the company level. They're sometimes discussed at the industry level.
Okay, can we move on to building on some of the things you've said, and you've identified areas for growth that if we work in the right way, you could actually then scale up, really transform and accelerate change positively, both for sustainable economic growth and other wider social challenges. You said a lot about, and you've around some of the kind of challenges or barriers, or perhaps, things that are just going to be potentially insurmountable if we're to achieve the long-term trajectory of economic growth. One of those is demographics. Can you explain what you mean by that? I think because we don't often talk about it in this kind of conversation. So I think from an MGI perspective, what are the implications of demographics for economics and competitiveness?
Yeah, so of course, we are not the demographics people, but we are looking at the economics, as you said, Dharmendra. We actually launched a report. It's called, on dependency and depopulation, to try to see what the effects are of the lower fertility rates that are happening almost everywhere in the world. The first fact that surprised me a little bit is, we live in this image. Yeah, this is maybe Japan and, a few other Western countries, but, the rest of the world is still, fine. But if you look at the waves of the development of the demographics, we are at 2.3 in the world right now. If you take sub-Saharan out, it's already 2.1. And that means that also large parts of the emerging markets, as we call it, or the global south, are getting to numbers that are hitting below replacement rate. And if the path continues, they might actually be at low replacement rate levels somewhere in the next 30 to 40 years as well. And then you might say, that doesn't matter because, isn't it good that we cool it down a little bit with the number of people, if you want to call it that way? The reality is, if you're at 1.4 in Europe or 1.2 in some countries in Europe, or you're at like 0.9, or depending on the measurement, sometimes even lower in South Korea or China or something like that. Just imagine that play out for 2-3 generations. That means that the base decimates. We all know the population pyramid, that it's growing population. Then we got the one that's sort of a tower, where, that's a stable population tower. And then I think we're going to go through a tower that gets longer because we get older, but the base of the tower becomes very narrow. And with that, it becomes fragile in a few ways that I'll explain. I think we spend all our time on the demographics, on the aging side of the curve, and not on the birth rate side of the curve. And in the aging mirror, we looked and say, we get older, and in a way we said, that's good, but maybe it costs us something. I would say largely the aging on that side we will solve. We're healthier for longer. Hopefully, we can do many things to be even healthier for longer. And I actually personally believe aging is a good thing. I'd like to live another 30 years. It's probably not in my cards personally, but I would like to see what happens in 30 years just for the fun of it. I will see. Maybe I get another 30 years, though. Great. But on the other side of the curve, that 1.4, 0.9 or something is actually creating a dependency effect that is at the rate that basically it will need so much of the productivity that we need to actually drive prosperity, that it eats into our ability to basically drive prosperity, because basically all the additional productivity per worker will be needed for that single worker to either pay for or deliver more to that aging population in that tower that goes like this. And then people say, yeah, but immigration will solve it. Let's go from the high population countries to the low population countries, and in that get it right. And the problem is the fertility rates there are dropping also. So
Right.
if you shift it by immigration, you just shift the problem from one place to another. Now, that might still have some economic positives or not. Now, the thing why I'm really struggling with this topic, and this is maybe one place where I'm not that optimistic, it is actually because people have tried for years and years, giving money, changing rules, maternity leave, all these rules, and the line didn't budge. If anything, continued to go down. So the tool set that we have now is certainly not working on changing this issue, even in the countries like Singapore or Hungary or whatever you might name that have tried this. And is that then our destiny, or can we still change it? To me, that's the big question.
Linked to that, Sven, one of the things that we all know, but we rarely talk about, other than the fact that now it's becoming a crisis in its own right. You see the movements in Spain around housing. We can see what the kind of elements of kind of uprising that are taking place in different parts of Europe. And, Spain is the most visceral, if you like, but we know it's across the board. I remember well enough, because I'm old enough, that, one of the things Thatcherism did was that she realized, actually, housing is a good basis for economic growth and development. So she opened up a market. So every bit of social housing was up for grabs, if you like. And so people who thought they'd never in their lifetimes own a home began to own homes. So she created a different kind of, let's say, middle class. And that's changed the trajectory of the UK, and other places have adopted a similar approach. What's happened is, and this is my assessment, but please correct me, because I think it's important to know that we've focused on private, profitable housing as opposed to social housing being made available. And so therefore, at the moment, most 30-year-olds in Spain, Portugal, Greece, and bits of France are living with their parents because they cannot access the housing market. They simply cannot, because the disposable income required to buy or rent a property is so high now that it's up to 40% of someone's income. So you've got a generation that when we grew up, had a different opportunity to get into the housing system. But now that's being squeezed out. Can you say a little bit about that?
We fully agree with the affordability of housing is a major problem. It's actually a major problem in the consideration of young people to have children, because they basically say, I can't afford a proper house.
Exactly.
I then sometimes joke, I lived in the bunk bed for a long time. Why is that not part of the solution? But I don't think that is the actual problem. So I'm not going to go there. To me, on the solution side, we can have a long discussion. But if you look at the housing market, those places in the world where supply of housing has been elastic, this problem is smaller. Now, in some places, there's more space. Suburban America, for example, has had more elastic housing and land supply that kept it a little lower. I'm not saying the problem is gone, but inside New York or inside Amsterdam, London, the supply has been problematic if it's
absolutely.
Now, I think there's also an incentive problem because a lot of equity sits in the hands of lots of people. In a strange way, the old people have the equity of the houses, but there's no mechanism to transfer that equity properly to the youth in a good way, because we wait until we die or retire. That's not the right moment to do it. And so I think whether it's social housing or not, we have to find a solution. At the minimum, we know this is a Georgian market where if you add a bit of supply, actually prices will drop or at least mute in their growth, which would be on a relative GDP base already good. We will have to find solutions for housing supply too. Now, if that's social or not, to me is a political choice. But at the minimum, somebody needs to say, you can build here. And if the supply goes up enough, the market will match at the price levels that people can afford. But at the moment, it's in many places significantly just a supply issue.
Absolutely. But when you go back to, if I can challenge you a little bit on the fact whether it's social or not is neither here or there, I think that's a really important, okay, you call it political, but an important economic question. Because if you're going to make housing affordable, you need to make sure that you are doing something which is in the social sector. When we think about the demographic of young people entering the labor market, and they're priced out of housing at the moment, we have enough land in most of our cities around Europe, if not more, loads of underpopulation that's taking place. And government could take an approach to say, you know what, we're going to target an opportunity for a builder to be incentivized to build at a certain price. It creates labor, it could create schools and a marketplace. No?
I'm just saying social housing, but who owns the houses is my point on social.
Okay.
The government needs to do something because they are the controllers of the land. And so it's clear that this needs an intervention. Without an intervention, this will not solve. And it's one of the important ones because if the entry in life becomes impossible in a certain way, or at least very hard, financially, of course, it makes it very hard. And this housing problem has not been cracked in that way.
Exactly. Let's as we conclude the conversation, I want to go back almost to the beginning and to the future. And what I mean by that is that we know there's chaos and turmoil in the system as we know it, from a financial, economic, even polity. There's no politeness happening either. There's no decency has been removed from the art of government and governance and political behavior, unfortunately. However, we know that, and you alluded to this, there are certain markets that are growing in a different way than we ever imagined. And I think about, in Nigeria will be the most populous country in the world in less than 7 years, with a huge youth population. The whole of Africa is going to be the largest youth population in the world. What are we going to do about that? India's going to have the largest middle class in the next 3 years, I'd say. And they're going to be, consuming, buying, and traveling. And you're going to have, etc., the same in Latin America. My point is this: at the moment, there's a flexing of a muscle or set of muscles that seems to divine a USA or a West of the past, having the power, the economic trajectory and growth and security at its helm and doing damage in the way it is. But our assessment is that power is going to swipe away and go to other places. And as the question is, you have a marketplace of America, which is, let's say, less than 400 million, or let's say around that. But you have a global market of 1.5 billion. If you were to think differently about how you play your stakes, can you reflect on that and say, is deregulation the way forward, Sven, in that context, what I've just described, but also those indices of change that are ahead of us?
We have said, when you look at the global order, there is no way that we can go domestic only. No region can be an island. We need each other. The Ricardian specialization will still exist. Whether fundamental large imbalances should stand, where one is a net buyer of the world and the other is a net seller to the world, I think that's what we're transitioning to in a pretty wild way. But we will have to have some form of global system. I think it'll end up in this more bilateral way of solving it. And for that, it will probably be blocks that do bilateral, because single countries will get too complex, in particular for the smaller ones. And hopefully on some stuff, it can still be just standard rules-based. When that's all done, it might then resettle. Okay, we now have retraded it to the place where we kind of have it. It could go rules-based again and then restart from that, maybe. In all of it, I think deregulation is part of the game. Because I think we are holding ourselves back from growth in many places, not just in the places that are growing now, also in the places that are growing less. And in all these places, regulation, might be the way. Now, that doesn't mean that we should not have high standards. I'm very much for high standards, hygiene, health, environment, and all that kind of stuff. But how detailed should the regulation be on the rest in terms of how the world works? That to me is interesting, and it's just hard to take it away. But I don't think deregulation is the real break on whether we get to the future or not. We should, in my view, not get bogged down in what I call the microscope of the here and now, where there's immense amount of issues, from terrorists to trade wars to wars and they are heavy. I mean, you feel it emotionally when you think about it. I feel it when I meet CEOs. The list that they need to go through is just at a completely different than it used to be for when we were settled in. So this unsettlement keep us busy because we're trying to work to a settlement. We should never forget that at the other end, prosperity for everybody looms. My only concern in this moment is that prosperity is hampered with, which I think you meant with how we behave, is that in that behavior, trust breaks.
Yeah.
And if you look at just from an economics perspective, and you just do a search on how important is trust to an economy, it's huge.
Right.
And so to me, the question is, as we resettle, we had a Cold War once, then we were post-Cold War. How do we resettle trust post-Cold War? I think it's a moment like this.
Excellent point to conclude on, Sven. So it's like trust economics in a way that we need to be thinking about it, don't we? And I never expected MGI to come up with that, but I know that you're not the usual craft, but you are where you are because of that dynamic thinking. Final message to both some of the captains of industry and the captains of the EU. What's your central message to them as they watch this in the context of what you've just described? And that central message about make sure you build trust in the system, but what's the message you'd like them to hear?
I would say, don't get bogged down in the detail. Structure the advancement in a few big blocks and make very big steps in that. If you want confidence to restore or remain or accelerate, it will come from people seeing us do stuff at scale that are very visible, even if they might not change all of Europe. Visible things that will bring us into a picture that we are winning. We'll scale the winning from there. If you do it in the basement of the bureaucracy, nobody will see it. This has to be sold to the people. as much as it will have to be sold to the system. And I think if we miss the chance to sell this to the people by not doing stuff that is big and beautiful enough, we will miss the chance to get this done because it will not have the support that it needs.
Excellent. As ever, we could go on forever, Sven. But as ever, what we have done, what you have done, is at least laid out a path, and you've populated with some key concepts for people to be thinking about, and that sense of, there is beauty to be had and made if you actually work in the right balanced way. But that final point around trust economics is absolutely key because it's so multi-layered. So thank you for your time and energy, and let's see what people, our viewers and listeners, make of this. But thank you very much for your time. Very good to see you, and hopefully see you again soon. And to you who are watching and listening, give us your thoughts, give us your views, write in, email, call us, whatever you want to do. Let us know what you think about what's been said by Sven Smit, Chair of McKinsey Global Institute. Thank you all. Look forward to seeing you again, and keep an eye on our next episode of #Critical Thinking. Take care. Goodbye.